Many people assume that in order to achieve cinematic videos, you need an expensive camera. And well, you've all heard this before, but the truth is, you don't. I've been shooting with a relatively inexpensive Canon T3i for a few years now, and it's been an absolute workhorse for me. Every video that I've made in recent memory has been shot using this camera. However, the quality of my work has still improved. Today I'm going to show you some techniques that help me get the most out of my camera. And to do this, I've set up a shot that is nothing but the opposite of cinematic. And yes, this is slightly exaggerated. The main advantage of my T3i is that it has full manual control, which most cameras do, you just may not know about it. This will allow me to customize the image, which will improve the final result and allow me to be more creative as well. So let's take a look at our camera settings first. While not exactly a camera setting, focus is one of the most important aspects of your shot to get right, since an out of focus shot will definitely not demonstrate the potential of the camera at all. I will manually turn the focus ring and use digital zoom on the LCD to make sure that I'm precise. And I avoid using autofocus because the camera tends to search throughout the shot, which drives me crazy, and if I want to do a focus pull, then I have more flexibility as well. So here's before we focused and after. Now the main idea with our camera settings is to allow as much natural light to hit the sensor as possible. Start by opening up your aperture to its maximum, and this will depend on the lens you're using. I'm using a constant aperture zoom that can open up all the way to f2.8, which is plenty of light. Along with controlling exposure, the aperture also affects the depth of field, or in other words, how blurry the background is. This is just controlling how selective the focus is. The lower your aperture, the blurrier your background will be, and this is usually considered to be cinematic, especially with tech videos on YouTube. Next, we want to make sure that our shutter speed is correct. The shutter speed affects exposure as well as the motion blur in your image. A general guideline for making sure that you have this right is by setting your shutter speed twice your frame rate. 1/50th of a second is not only the industry standard, but also roughly double my frame rate of 24 frames per second, which creates a natural amount of motion blur. Now as you can see, our image is way too bright, so let's lower the ISO. The ISO correlates to the sensor's sensitivity to light. So in other words, it digitally brightens the image. This has the same effect as brightening a dark image up in Photoshop, which doesn't look too good. Most cameras, especially cheaper ones, tend to produce very grainy images at higher ISOs. Even though this allows you to see in the dark, it really is a last resort. Now our exposure is looking a bit dark, but we can compensate for this by setting up lights, which we will get to. Now that our camera is set up correctly, we can now focus on the more creative things. Let's start by making sure that our composition is on point. A good starting point is leveling the camera, which I can easily do by using a leveling bubble found on most rigging equipment. Next, I will use the rule of thirds to properly position the subject in the center or sides of the frame. I also want to consider the focal length I'm using on my lens, or in other words, how zoomed in I am. This will affect not only the composition, but also the compression of the background. So let's zoom in a little. Next up is lighting, but before we do that, we need to make sure that the built-in colors are accurate. So to avoid this cooler look we have, let's change our white balance to a daylight setting. You could also just set this yourself using the Kelvin adjustments, or use a white balance card. You're just telling the camera what the color white is. Now for lighting, I just start out by setting up 3-point lighting. This will consist of a key, fill, and rim light. So let's start by turning on a key light angle to the side a bit. This light is what is primarily lighting our subject. Now as you can see, this is very harsh and creates really ugly distinct shadows. So let's shape the light by diffusing it with a softbox. This then lowers the intensity and also gets rid of those ugly shadows. Here's before we diffused and after. Next we can bring in our fill light, which fills in the other side of the subject, hence the name. And finally, to add dimension, let's put a smaller light behind the subject to create separation. And this adds some dimension to the shot. And next is the fun part, which is lighting the background. I like to throw lights out of focus in the background to create some bokeh. Now even though I'm using pretty expensive and proper lighting gear, you can really do this with any household lights and materials. Stay tuned for a video on that coming up. Now a bonus step is using a picture profile, which improves the dynamic range. You can think of dynamic range like the amount of information you can see in the shadows or darker parts of your image. I'm using the Vision Color profile, which flattens the image to do just that. This also gives me the opportunity to lower the in-camera sharpening to avoid moire and aliasing. When comparing before and after, this is a drastic difference, and even though it might not look as good in camera, that is where color grading comes in. Let's take this shot into post to add a color grade. I'll usually just boost the contrast, saturation, and sharpen it a bit, but I'll get into that along with my full editing process in a separate video. But now we've gone from a very amateur shot to something much more thought out, and the result could definitely be considered cinematic in my book. Thanks for watching. I hope that this inspires you to think creatively and use what you have to the best of its ability. You can see that most of the difference came from lighting and it wasn't even related to the camera. It's all about being creative. Thanks for watching, stay tuned for more videos, and I'll talk to you later.